Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce's Ukraine War news update for the 21st of November 2023, the first part thereof. And not too much content to talk about today. It's been quite a quiet 24 hours and last night as well with regard to activity. I think if we look at the general staff figures for the Russian losses of the day before, we can see that the figures are lower than yesterday. And yesterday was a quiet day, possibly because it was a Monday, talking about Sunday figures. But I think more likely the weather is taking an effect. And that's why we are seeing continued low figures today. Referring to yesterday, 610 personnel is still a high number, but it's not as high as it was in the previous sort of week. The day before notwithstanding. We have 0 tanks, 6 APVs and 4 pieces of artillery. Those are very low figures, all things considered. 7 drones and 1 cruise missile, not from last night and the night before. And then 7 vehicles and fuel tanks and 1 piece of special equipment. These are relatively low numbers. And when we look to Andrew Perpetua, the mapper who counts up the equipment lost from evidence from video feeds and social media threads, he has found that again we've got 3-1 probably Russian to Ukrainian loss ratio. So I say again because it's generally in the 3, 4, 5-1 ratio. Sometimes it approaches parity, but not too often. And these are the kind of ratios that, well, you could argue that Ukraine actually need greater ratio than 3-1 to be able to win the war in terms of attrition, given the size of the Russian stocks and inventories. We look at the Ukrainian losses. It's not particularly high quality, high value, sorry. Max Pros, M113, those are kind of, they're not low value, as in they're not valueless. Of course they're not, but they are. They have a fair number of these. M113s are old bits of kit that the West has donated or somehow got to the Ukrainians. So, yeah, that's not too much of a worry. The Russians have lost a couple of radars here, which I think are a bit of a worry for their capabilities. In fact, these are 2 that were lost in Kursk. So it is interesting that that's not within the occupied regions of Ukraine, but actually over the border into Russia. A couple of bits of, artillery, tank, IFV kind of stuff, and then the rest trucks and civilian vehicles. So a lot of logistics hit here. And I guess it's also significant to note that most things are damaged and not destroyed. Whether they are reparable, I don't know. If we go to now look at this bit of footage, and obviously I can't show you the video, the whole of these videos, I'll just show you them as stills. You can go and watch these videos by clicking on the links in the description below. Unfortunately, they get me restricted. So on November the 18th, Ukrainian units hit 2 expensive Russian radar stations, the GUR reports, near the settlement of Dmitriev in the Kursk region in Russia. A 55ZH6 Nebo mobile unit band radar complex and a Gamma S1E mobile 3D radar were detected and damaged or destroyed. So these are high value bits of kit, and the Ukrainians will be happy with taking those out. Ukrainian HIMARS missile destroys a Russian R149 AKSH-1 command vehicle in the Avdiivka sector. And why it's worth noting these hits is because you can see a strategic an operational project in the Kherson Oblast, Kherson region near Dnipro River, where the Ukrainians are explicitly degrading, well, you could say everything within a particular range from Dnipro River from their bridgeheads, but they're particularly wanting to take out electronic warfare systems, artillery pieces in this case. In the next case, you'll see a Grad getting taken out, and air defense systems as well. So I think they're doing a good job of doing that. We're seeing a lot of footage of stuff getting taken out in the Kherson area. This is a HIMARS strike on a Russian command vehicle R149 AKSH-1 command vehicle. And I think that will be a sore loss for the Russians. They will lose some ISR capabilities and obviously some command and control capabilities. Also worth noting that it's a HIMARS strike as well, so it's quite a high value munition. See, it's a high value target there. And with a command and control vehicle getting taken out like that, you might also take out some high value personnel targets as well, some actual commanders. A direct hit on a Russian B-21 Grad MLRS system that was shelling Ukrainian positions in the Kherson region. So they saw this taking out, firing off, and then followed it and then hit it. What's interesting here, and I've seen a couple of these over the last couple of days, or last day actually, just this morning, where Russian vehicles have been hit by a drone, and actually the damage looks really minimal, but the crew run away, as you would. I mean, it's pretty natural. You get hit by a drone, you don't know what will happen as a result of that drone, whether there'll be secondary cooking off. With it's not certain that this piece has been lost. I mean, it cuts out after just showing a very small explosion with this spotter camera here, and it kind of replays in a loop that explosion and cuts out. So, but you do see the people running away. My guess is they'll probably return to that, and it might well be operational again afterwards. And that's the second one that I've seen. As I said today, the other one I think was a tank. The crew ran away, or it's abandoned and is hit later by something else. I don't know. I mean, when it's being spotted like this, that the Ukrainians are going to be aware of what's going on with that piece of kit. Nonetheless, that has at least been damaged. Russian forces targeted probably an ammunition depot of the Ukrainians in the east of Karlivka village, west of Vodyanye. I presume this is a Vodyanye up near Avdiivka. So here we have the Russians doing, obviously, strikes of ammunition depots and similar targets. It's not just the Ukrainians that do that, obviously. And a couple of these I've seen this morning. Not quite sure what's going on here. So, friendly fire. A Russian Ka-52M accidentally striking their own abandoned modified MTLB with an ATGM. And it's been geolocated. I say I'm not quite sure what's going on here because it's not abandoned. This is moving. This vehicle is definitely moving before it gets hit. And there's also other stuff going on. There's fire coming out here. From a vehicle. Sometimes, we see that and it's a purposeful burning of fields. But just not quite sure what's going on there. And I can't verify it's definitely a Ka-52 taking out one of their own, but that is what is reported here. And then there's another one here, which is definitely different footage because this is not moving. Russian footage showing a Russian Mi-28NM helicopter on a Russian MTLB. So again, it's a claim it's an MTLB. So, you're thinking, well, could it be the same kind of APC getting taken out? But it's not. It seems different to me. Armored vehicle with an anti-tank guided missile near Novomykhailivka, southwest of Donetsk. So possibly two bits of friendly fire. Sometimes you get abandoned vehicles getting taken out on purpose because they are abandoned and you don't want the enemy to get hold of them and use them. This is why they say, doctrine should be that if you're going to abandon your vehicle, throw in a bunch of hand grenades before you abandon it, because you need to make sure it's not going to be used against you. It's kind of like this zero-sum game. Understanding that if we lose it to the enemy gains it, and so that's like a double whammy. We need to just lose it ourselves and stop the enemy from getting hold of it, so throw grenades in. But there's been this complaint that the Russians have not done this over the course of the war, that they abandon their equipment and then just run away, and that gives it to the Ukrainians. So it could be that the ATGM is fired on purpose to destroy the abandoned vehicle. However, I don't think that vehicle's abandoned. This one, on the other hand, I don't know. There are people around it, though. So anyway, possibly two friendly fire incidences of the Russians hitting their own kit. Right. Overnight, so on to distant strikes. 10 Shahed drones were flown into Ukraine. 9 were shot down, so 90% interception rate, which is pretty good, but then not a really big wave there. Additionally, and I do wonder about this. I do wonder when they release these rather small waves of attacks, whether this is just a bad use of drones or whether these are just hunting out, not really thinking they're going to get to their targets, but just trying to find out where the air defenses are around Ukraine. So a 10 Shahed wave is a small wave, but could just be gathering intelligence. And if it's not doing that, I just think it's not a good use of drones and bad strategy. Additionally, a single launch Iskander-K was shot down. Also, several S-300 missiles were launched at Ukraine, of which the impact is still being determined. S-300s, as you well know by now probably, are surface-to-air missiles used in a ground attack mode that are very difficult to shoot down, and so they generally get through, but they're not very accurate. So the damage assessment will probably involve looking at civilian infrastructure being hit and just thinking that the Russians are war criminals again. That's usually what happens. So Russia claims 2 Ukrainian drones were shot down overnight, or downed overnight. And they were downed in the Kursk region and another over Oryol region on November the 21st, according to Russian Defense Ministry and local governor. Well, the one in the Kursk region could well be pertaining to the radars that were hit within Kursk. So it downed by the targets that they hit could be the explanation there, or could be separate incident. I don't know. Right, moving on to other bits and pieces. So one of 3 teens arrested after a train was set on fire in Russia in Tyumen has been revealed to be a native of Ukraine. 15-year-old faces charges of setting fire to an electric locomotive. He could be jailed for up to 20 years. Wow, think of that, 15-year-old not getting out of jail until he's 35. Cabin was empty and only wiring was damaged. But yeah, brave stuff for that young partisan in Russia. Zelensky's done an awful lot of speaking overnight, saying quite a few things, I think, in his nightly speech, but also outside of that. I'll try and gather everything he said, but here we have him being concerned about the Churchill phenomenon of a wartime successful leader being defeated in an election, according to the Guardian's sources. This is, I don't know if you realise, particularly if you're not British, but interestingly, Winston Churchill, after the war, he's so famous for success in the Second World War, failed as like a peacetime leader and lost an election. Let's look at the details there. So just looking at this, you can see why Zelensky might be a little bit worried. This is just a random BBC history article, why Churchill lost in 1945. One of the reasons why Churchill lost in the general election in 45 was because he had succeeded in completing the almost superhuman task he had taken on in 1940, and in a way this made him redundant. The conduct of the war, however, was his overriding passion, and military victory was by far the most important of his goals. Thus, everything else, including party politics, was secondary. As a result, when the war came to an end and party politics resumed, Churchill suddenly found himself without a clear sense of purpose or action. I mean, there's lots more detail to this, but just in general, the war weariness was probably a factor against Churchill among civilians and servicemen alike. The result plunged him into a depression and his party into shock, but it was not quite as bad as it seemed. The first past the post system gave an exaggerated picture of Labour's triumph, disguising the fact that just over half of the electorate had voted against them. First past the post electoral system is something I fundamentally am not a fan of, so I think it's interesting that played a part there. Anyway, Zelensky is worried about going down that same route. The publication writes that President's ratings are still quite high, although the level of support and trust in him is gradually falling amid the ongoing war. You might imagine he could quit after the war finishes, given that, let's assume that might happen in, say, I don't know, a year's time or something. He would quit and say, right, I've done my job, it's up to someone else to take this on. And then you quit on a high, still generally respected, particularly around the world, I would imagine. So that could be one of his options that he takes. On September 12th, and I reported this, in Siberia, Russians landed a stolen passenger plane in a field due to a malfunction. The plane is still there. They couldn't take it away, so they built a fence around it. Incredible. So I can't imagine that in any other country, a passenger plane that landed in a field would just be left there because there was no ability to remove it or no, I guess, desire. Just one of the final things here. This is the UK Ministry of Defence saying at least 11,000 Ukrainian children are in 43 re-education camps, scare quotes, re-education camps, in the Russian Federation. Quote, the right to life and freedom of such children is under threat. This is just a horrible war crime again. And finally, because it's quite quiet, I'm just going to go through a summary from Radu Hosu and see if I agree with it. He's a Romanian sort of political analyst that is he's also helped a lot in Ukraine. He's probably there at the moment, does a lot of fundraising, and has put together some armoured hospital vehicles and whatnot that were indeed targeted by the Russians, and they blew one of them up, which is absolutely terrible. Anyway, I'm back. Good to have met you again. He says, right, since it's been almost a month since my last night summary, I'll try to summarise in this post the latest events of the day and in the days to come, etc., etc. So in the Orikhiv-Tokmak axis, this has been the axis in which the Ukrainians have put the most effort since July until now. If you recall, this is where there was a failed attack by the armed forces of Ukraine that resulted in the loss of several Bradley and Leopard 2 tanks. After that failure, the Ukrainian army changed its attack tactics and managed to break through of the first line of the multi-layered Surovikin line defense. These days, the Ukrainians are attacking Verbovy to the east and Kopani to the west. But the counteroffensive along this axis has decreased in intensity. Personal opinion. The minimal objective of the counteroffensive to reach Tokmak has failed for several reasons. The mined land is so densely mined that it exceeds even US doctrine on defensive mined land by dozens of times. Basically, the Russians put a colossal logistical and material effort into not allowing the Ukrainians to break through in a short time. The lack of air support is another serious reason for the failure. Ukraine does not have enough aircraft and has far too few intelligent long-range munitions to destroy the Russian anti-aircraft defenses behind the Surovikin line. A lack of Western equipment in large enough numbers that Ukraine can afford considerable armor losses and still continue the advance, as the Russians are doing at Avdiivka, which I will write about below. It's an interesting idea that they just didn't have enough of those to warrant losing them in a big punch through. And actually, that's what the NATO doctrine and NATO advice was to do, which was just concentrate only on one area, punch through. You're going to lose a bunch of stuff, but you'll get through. And when they started losing that stuff in Malotokmachka, and this was getting out on social media, there was all this outcry, and so they stopped doing that. They didn't want to lose that kit, and that's partly to do with because they didn't have enough of it, and they weren't promised more going forward. So if you say, right, we've got, 60 Leopards or whatever, we know we're going to get another 60 Leopard 2s at this point, and then another 60 after that. We can afford to lose those attritionally in doing this push. But if you don't know that you've got that going forward, and this is the criticism about not knowing that they've got continuous equipment being delivered, that high value, decent quality, modern Western main battle tanks and IFVs, they don't know they're going to get that, then you're going to be much more cautious with the way you use it. And this is what happened. Now, you can argue that wouldn't have been a good use of their equipment, and they shouldn't have gone through that big kind of attritional loss in order to punch through, but then they might well have punched through and got to the end, and the means justify the end, which is an evil, a suffering for a greater good at the end. It's that trolley experiment I talk about so often. You might say, actually, we're going to expend this amount of equipment and human life in order to achieve that greater good. So Russian electronic warfare combined with Ka-52 Alligator attack helicopters have made smart artillery, ammunition, Excalibur, and main battle tanks, Leopard 2 and Challenger 2, but have also IFVs like Bradley to advance easily. The English is a bit mixed, but basically electronic warfare and attack helicopters have stopped that equipment being able to advance easily. Is this axis a lost one? From my perspective, it is not. It's an axis that the Ukrainians will also rely on in the winter and next year's attacks, because here the Russians suffer considerable losses due to their active defense doctrine, whereby they try to regain any lost ground. The active defense is the reason why the Russians have lost almost 1,000 men a day across the front lines every day for the last month, which is a record for the whole period of this war. Okay, going on to Bakhmut, extremely heavy fighting is going on from Andriivka towards Odradivka. Similarly, battles are fought towards Bakhmut from Klishivka, but the Ukrainian advances are not significant. Personal opinion, the objective of encircling Bakhmut has failed so far, and I don't think it has any chance of success this year. However, this year's counteroffensive, especially in the south, has created the opportunity that next year we may see a breakthrough of Russian lines south of Bakhmut, and that is if Ukrainian coordination is improved and Western equipment arrives on time. Right. I don't know if he's talking about Ukrainian encirclement there. I don't think realistically Ukraine ever tried to encircle Bakhmut. So I don't think that part of the opinion is valid. If they really tried to encircle Bakhmut, they would have been doing an awful lot more up to the north, and they just didn't. They didn't have enough forces in Ukraine. So I think it was taking advantage of weak Russian positions in certain areas until Russian got enough troops in place, and then started, the Ukrainians effectively culminated and the Russians started to push back. I think essentially the Ukrainians were doing what they could with what they had, and I thought it was pretty successful given that they didn't throw an awful lot at Bakhmut. And then when things were going south, maybe elsewhere, some of those troops may have been pulled out of Bakhmut, meaning that the Ukrainians were seriously not going to make any more advances. So I'm not sure that they were really trying to encircle Bakhmut. Really, in fact, they almost certainly weren't. Or if they were trying to do it with absolutely nothing. So. And not trying to attack in the north, which is like, you're never going to encircle somewhere if you can only do it from one side. You just be chasing around in a circle. Anyway, that's my opinion. Kherson axis. This is where the Ukrainians have the most initiative. They have managed to stabilize several bridgeheads across the island area and the Dnipro River, specifically in the locality of Krynki. It's the most consolidated bridgehead. Another consolidated bridgehead is the Pishchanivka area, and it goes towards the town of Poima. Another bridgehead that will open specifically to threaten Crimea is the one I wrote about more than 3 months ago, Holopristan. Also here a few days ago, the Russians announced that they withdraw their positions a few kilometers to the southeast. Today they told the citizens of Leshki to evacuate the town and indicated that the Russians are ready for another goodwill gesture and to hand the town over to the Ukrainians for liberation. Not sure that's quite what happened. I think the administration has been told to leave, but I don't think the citizens have been told to leave, but I might be wrong. Personal opinion, if a month ago the opening of the new front Kherson was only at the level of wishful thinking, now we are as clearly faced with a fact. At this moment, the Russian commanders are put in a very unpleasant situation, which I will repeat. After destroying the dam at Novkakhovka, the Russians did not expect the Ukrainians to land heavy armor and several companies of the 36th, 37th, 38th Ukrainian Marine Brigades on the eastern bank of Dnipro. Thus, this landing, which I witnessed as it was happening, is the biggest gain for the Ukrainians in months and is an operational, not just tactical one. So he is actually in the Kherson area at the moment. I knew he was previously. Russian counteroffensive in Kupiansk. After more than 2 months, the Russians were emphatically announcing that they would encircle Kupiansk using more than 1,000 pieces of armor. Until today, they have not made any notable advance. I repeat, no notable advance, but their losses have been heavy, and they are counted in the daily Russian losses that the Ukrainians publicize. Personal opinion, this winter also Kupiansk and Avdiivka will be the two big points. A lot of people talk about Kupiansk and that north being an area that the Russians, they're worried that the Russians are going to attack. So Radu Hosu is another one of these people. It will be two big points that the Russians are aiming to conquer. In the case of Avdiivka, the Russians have a chance. In the case of Kupiansk, without a mobilization far superior to the one so far, this goal remains far from reality. And then goes on to talk about Avdiivka. Since my last summary almost a month ago, the Russians have managed to capture Terikon, basically the coke plant dump, and control the railway north of Avdiivka. To the south, they managed small advances, but the Ukrainians managed to counterattack in the south as well as in the north, and thus foiled the Russians' plans to encircle the town. To the south towards Donetsk, the Russians advanced towards the industrial area and a few hundred meters to the west. The Ukrainians managed to counterattack that surprised the Russians, advancing towards the M30 motorway. A personal opinion, the battle for Avdiivka, like the battle for Bakhmut, will go down in the history of modern warfare. It's the first If the first was a lesson in how to decimate the Russian army in a small town, Bakhmut had 70,000 inhabitants before the war and no strategic importance. At Avdiivka, 32,000 inhabitants before the war, the Russians suffered their heaviest post-World War II losses in a single front sector. More than 100 tanks and 250 armoured vehicles were lost by the Russians, according to Ukrainian statements. Even if we don't want to take the AFU statement at face value, we have enough drone video footage showing multiple columns of Russian armour on different days simply being wiped off the face of the earth. Over 5,000 dead Russians suffered here and probably over 10,000 wounded. Consider that in the entire 10-year war against Afghanistan, the Russians lost about 15,000 people. Okay, so that's his idea of what's going on there. I think Avdiivka is looking precarious. I think Bakhmut is not great for the Ukrainians, but it depends how many troops the Russians commit to Bakhmut. Kherson is looking slightly better for the Ukrainians, and the southern front line around Zaporizhia has pretty much ground to a halt. Anyway, let me know what you guys think of the present situation along the front lines. Please like, subscribe, and share. Take care, and speak to you soon.